Well, good afternoon, colleagues. I am very pleased to be with you, and congratulations on what looks like an exciting event. I was able to catch a bit of the earlier discussion, and saw a lot of excitement around innovation, but also saw some trepidation about the risks of this brave new world of payments. My role this afternoon is really to do a little bit of a summary, to pull together some of the threads that have been covered throughout the day, but also to look ahead at what might be the future of payments. I work as a futurist, as a scenario planner, and so normally when we do scenarios, what we do is we look at the trends, we look at the drivers of those trends, and then we synthesize those into various alternative scenarios, different futures. One of the difficulties with the payments world, it's changing super quickly, and it's changing in multiple ways all at the same time, and that means that there are huge uncertainties. We just don't know what the regulation will look like. We just don't know who's going to win in terms of market share. We don't know which payment platform, which rail, which protocol is going to be the dominant one. And so how do you lead, how do you manage in the context of a changing payments world? And so hopefully the conversation we have will inform you a little bit about how to think about how you navigate that world. And so I've titled it From Rails to Intelligent Systems, that there's really quite a fundamental shift going on in the world of payments. This fundamental shift is not only about payments. It's part of a broader fundamental shift happening at an economic level from a real world physical economy to a digital virtual economy, from an old world, unintelligent, mechanized economy to a new world, intelligent, artificially enabled economy. And so payments in some ways is just a product of that. So how do we navigate that world? So what I want to start by doing is unpacking a little bit what I call 14 game changers. Why are we seeing these changes? What are the drivers of change? What are the game changers? And what are the risks that they represent? And so the first one, it's not new to you. This is the sea in which you swim. Real-time instant payment rails. They've come around in the last sort of 15, 20 years. They've been adopted in certain countries. Governments have built them out. The private sector has crowded in. The consumer has adopted them. And so what are we able to do? Through FedNow, UPI, EU Instant, payments are enabled real-time, 24/7, all around the world. What comes with that is the risk of speed. In the old days, if you did a transaction and someone showed up midway and put a gun to your head and stole your wallet, this is something that would take minutes, hours. If they took you hostage, it could take days, and they would rob you. In this world, that robbery, that threat happens instantly within seconds through things like hacking, crypto hacking, and other forms of intervention by criminality. And so the sheer speed of these payment rails creates a risk in that, do we have the speed to deal with the fraud, the potential theft, the potential intervention of what these things enable? The second big one, again something you're quite familiar with, is part of the bigger evolution of digital identity. I remember my son, when he was about 7 years old, coming to me one evening in the living room and saying, "Dad, I need your credit card." And I said, "Why do you need my credit card?" He said, "Because I want to buy V-Bucks." I said, "Well, it's 7 o'clock at night. You're not going to the store now." He said, "No, I don't want to go to the store. I want to buy V-Bucks in my PlayStation, in my virtual world, which my cousin and I have created in, I forget the name of the game, where they've created some kind of virtual digital world." I said, "Explain to me V-Bucks." "Well, Dad, V-Bucks, virtual, duh. You've had the experience." So I said, so you're saying there's a virtual currency which you want me to pay for with my real currency, and you're 7. So let's have a discussion. What do you want to use the V-Bucks for? He said, "Well, Dad, I need to buy a skin." So I said, "Well, you have a skin. I mean, I know it's South Africa, and I know skin matters a lot, but what do you mean you want to buy a skin?" Now, inside the game, I have a persona. I have a character. And my persona needs a new skin. It can be male, female, pink, blue, yellow, purple, guns, no guns. And so these kids are growing up in a world where identity is not something physical. If you think that digital identity is about facial recognition, you're in 1993. Digital identity is about the projection of multiple identities and personas that we choose to use depending on where we are. Are we at work? Are we on the internet? Are we in some kind of subcultured world where we're entertaining ourselves, where we're co-creating content? And so in the payments world, the digital identity will have multiple fingerprints and multiple faces. What this means is there's a new form of risk that emerges, where of course those identities can be stolen, they can be replicated, and they raise risks about how do we protect that privacy of those identities as we use them. The third big game changer is, of course, tokenization of assets. In this world, I can exchange value through the exchange of assets that are virtual, digital, or I can create a virtual digital version of the bottle of water in front of you. And I can trade and exchange the value of the water by trading and exchanging the virtual asset. It's a wonderful innovation. The risk associated with that is a bit like buying something on Timo. Nothing against, I've bought some good things on Timo. Have you had the Timo experience? Where you buy a shelf and then you get a shelf? Right? In this world of tokenization of assets, the difficulty is it's not like the old world where you walk into a shop and you see a quality product, you can pick it up, you can feel it, you can smell it, you can weigh it. It's a world where we have to trust the system that the story that we're being told about the nature of the asset behind the token is in fact there. And so it raises the risk. We solve that risk through things like smart contracts, etc., but it does raise that risk, and it raises risks of the manipulation of that. Stable coins, digital currencies, lots of talk about Bitcoin, some talk about shit coins, that's a real technical term. Stable coins, meme coins, what are these things? They're essentially code that travels through the internet, gets stored in a cryptographic wallet that allow you to capture value and store value through a digital code. And they all, to some way, shape, or form, run on the blockchain and get exchanged through the internet and require cryptography to protect them. And so we're in a world where not only does some genius over there create a cryptocurrency called a Bitcoin or something, but you can have a celebrity like the Hak2 girl create a meme coin that is a fashionable icon that people put real money into, and they can exchange that meme coin, and such as Doge, for instance. That's the one with the dog. They can exchange that meme coin and they can own it. And there's of course a big debate around the future of these coins. There's an argument on that side of the stage that says these coins are worthless. They're not backed by anything in the real world. So there's no gold, dollar, property behind the coin. So what is its inherent value? Then there's a second argument which moves a little bit from that extreme to this extreme here, which says, well, if the coin has scarcity and someone can control the ownership and distribution, then it has value purely on the basis of its scarcity, which is sort of the Bitcoin value argument that there won't be more of them, and the scarcity combined with the ability to control them creates the inherent value. And then there's a third argument that says, well, the value is in fact in the democratization of the coin. The fact that the coin can move around the world without the naughty government controlling your life. So the sort of libertarian view. Whether we agree with those views or not, digital currencies, coins are here and they're here to stay. Now, institutionally, different organizations have responded by trying to secure the value of those coins, sometimes by backing them, pegging them to the dollar, call it a stable coin. Other times by creating an institutional-only coin, like a JP Morgan digital currency. The risk that these coins present is the possibility of regulatory arbitrage. It erodes the monetary sovereignty of countries. So if I can take R1 million and convert it into XRP and transfer that XRP to a cryptographic wallet in Japan, and then convert it from XRP to yuan or ruble, I can own the currency in a foreign country without any exchange controls. And so the erosion of the sovereignty is the risk. And of course, the question then is, how will governments ultimately respond to that risk? Will they respond to it by trying to regulate a highly democratized emerging market of these coins, or will it come with a heavy hand and try and control them? In the end, because the coins are not backed by anything substantive, if it comes with a heavy hand, it will destroy the value. And so there's a real risk like that that there's a whole segment of the global economy now running in the hundreds of billions that can evaporate in an instant. It's a pretty big systemic risk. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have them in your portfolio. No risk, no reward. The next one here, mobile-first payment platforms. We know all about this. This is our bread and butter, the ability to exchange value by quick payments through a mobile phone. And we see in the global south, if you look at the world at the global level, 9 billion people, 4.5 billion of those will be in Africa by the year 2050. 4.5 billion will be in Asia. More than half of them are unbanked, unlikely to be banked by formal institutional banks, most likely to be reached by mobile-first payment platforms. And those will probably not be a mobile phone. It might be a wearable device like a watch or a pair of glasses. And so the ability for an Indian national in a rural area to walk into a clinic and pay for medical services through a bangle, it's very likely. And there will likely be 1 billion of those. The risk that they raise is the opportunities for SimSwap, where some third party exchanges the digital ID of that object and can make payments on your behalf. Fraud, network reliability. It's a bit like that highway in Cape Town that goes to nowhere. As we build out the infrastructure for these digital payments, it's very likely that the interests of those building out that infrastructure won't go far enough for this to ultimately become an integrated global solution for payments. Because in whose interest is it to build out that infrastructure? And so this raises systemic structural risks. Open interoperable protocols. So to run these systems, we need rules. We need standards. We need regulations. We call them protocols. There is the potential for a global, connected, standardized, interoperable global payments protocol. But who is going to create that in a world where the UN is losing its relevance, where countries are pulling in different directions? You're going to create it? That's an open invitation. And I can hear the comments and the questions coming through on the app. We'll look at them in a minute. And so who creates those shared standards? There's a real opportunity there, but there's also a real threat of payment fragmentation. So I'm sure the speakers in the morning touched on this. One of the unintended consequences of Mr. Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine was the form of asymmetrical warfare which the United States exacted on Russia, not in the forms of bombs, but in the forms of sanctions on the payment system. Now, the unintended consequence of the United States putting financial sanctions on Russia has been the acceleration of the appetite among the Russians and the elites there to support alternative forms of payment, alternative payment in alternative currencies to the dollar. So de-dollarization, but it's also reinforced the narrative of alternatives to the dollar, such as the BRICS currency. Now, these ideas are in their nascent form institutionally. But what this represents at a payment level is that we now have great powers like China, Russia, Iran, to some extent India, who are incentivized on the basis of their national interest not to build out a unified, global, standardized, interoperable protocol. And so the risk is real of fragmentation, global disputes, creating vulnerabilities, and creating friction and difficulties in the system. Now, in spite of that, we see this, and this is why there's uncertainty. On the one hand, there's fragmentation. On the other hand, we do see continent cross-border payment networks emerge. The ability of, for instance, the PAPs to transfer money all across Africa, do settlements, remittances, reimbursements. This raises questions and difficulties around regulatory standardization and misalignment. We know all about that. And how do we close those gaps? Now, in response to these features emerging, one of the big drivers of change has become central bank digital currencies. Now, central banks, by their nature, are risk-averse, are large, slow-moving institutional actors. Everything else I've mentioned is risk-prone, small-scale, fast-moving in terms of how it's come about. And so there's real paradox here of, can central banks move quickly enough, innovate fast enough to develop these kinds of currencies in a way that is sustainable? I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. I was recently in the US talking to a person who's working on the back end of the US Congress. Because what they have in the US Congress is millions and millions and millions of pages of law, old school paper-based law, which now has been digitized into thousands and thousands of pages of websites, the Internet 1.0. But now what you have is the infrastructure for those digital forms of law is aging. And the institutions don't exist to reform and revitalize the digital infrastructure. So the US, unless they fix that, might lose the institutional memory of Congress. And so they need to pass a law in Congress to fund Congress to fix its own website. You see the problem? They need 5 years of lawmaking to fix a 1-year digital platform problem. And so there's an inherent risk around privacy concerns, surveillance potential, and inherent vulnerabilities of that at an institutional level. Especially in countries where you have populist politics, risks to that. Sovereign digital payment infrastructure, as countries respond to these various game changes that I've mentioned, they are building out these sovereign systems. I've spoken about geopolitical fragmentation, interoperability gaps. The next one that emerges, which is quite interesting, that little image there of the green dot is a military radar system. Now, what you do with a military radar system is you scan the environment to see what's coming at you. Is it ships? Is it planes? Is it drones? Why do you do that? Because that is what we call the attack surface of your warfare. Are we at war on land or sea or in the sky through drones or planes? We're now in a world, because of these developments, that there's a new attack surface for conflict. And it is the attack surface of digital payments. The infrastructure, the networks, the platforms, the apps, where it's very likely, and it would be unfortunate if this scaled, but it's very likely that we will see new forms of asymmetrical conflict and warfare attacking those platforms as part of undermining sovereignty. At the moment, TikTok is an entertainment platform. But what happens when TikTok, like Facebook, develops a digital currency, Facebook with Libra, and TikTok, like Facebook, develops a marketplace where the TikTok you're watching is not of a person doing a silly dance, it's of a garment that they are modeling so that you can buy it with a TikTok dollar. That's the world into which we're moving. And that world creates sovereign risks, which is why the US, in this particular case of TikTok, has forced China, essentially, to sell the company to the US. Because the US understands it has to protect the data and the society in terms of what they put their eyeballs on. And soon what they put their wallets on in a digital payments world. The next one here, and we're almost through the game changers, algorithmic governance of payment systems. Now, I mentioned at the start that these payments are moving fast. They're moving across multiple platforms very quickly, and this is a complex environment. And so one of the solutions to that is to build the software, algorithms, and AI-based agents that can do the monitoring for you in real time. And because you can't monitor 5 million transactions in 5 minutes, but what you can do is monitor the 5 transactions that the algorithm tells you look suspicious. It's a bit like the facial recognition cameras in London, where recently the police from Scotland Yard arrested a criminal because the AI in Scotland Yard in the police service told them that the criminal had committed a crime, because it saw the criminal's face on a video camera in the street. And so this is the payments version of that. It raises questions about accountability. Cybersecurity, we've touched on, the previous panel spoke at length about cybersecurity. One of the difficulties as these systems grow out is the complexity that they represent. And how do you build a security system with the complexity and the sophistication to respond to the complexity of your system? The reason I've put these little engines down here, these are the engines that Elon Musk is using to take his big rockets to space, to deliver people at the space station. The one on the left was the first one he built. The second one is the second one he's built. The third one is the third one he's built. Why has he built that third one in that way? Because he has an engineering principle which he calls delete. Every time they invent something or something new or rebuild it, they look at each component and they ask 2 questions. Why is it there? And can we delete it? Something the banking system is not famous for. Why is this system here? And what would happen tomorrow if we deleted it? It's too risk averse. So we don't delete any systems. And so we end up with a stack and a shelf of interconnected monsters. I got an email not long ago from a bank that I joined when I was 16. That is 30 years ago. And I got a SMS actually asking me if this is my correct email address. And it was my first email address when I worked for the first time at the age of 18. Somewhere in the legacy system, it remembers that email address. And so there's a principle here around if we want it to be safe and secure, we need to simplify, and that means we have to delete some of the redundancies. Now, into this environment comes the most recent, very exciting trend, which is generative agentic AI. Maybe you've used ChatGPT and you've asked it to write a poem about your auntie, which is great. ChatGPT was the first to the market with what we call an LLM, a large language model. What it was basically doing is taking lots of knowledge in the form of text, and it had written a little algorithm which has the ability to anticipate, based on the relationship between the words, which word is likely to come next. It's called a large language model. So if I sing a song to you that says, jingle bells, jingle bells, you know the word bells comes next because your large language model anticipates which word comes next. That was what ChatGPT was doing. It was just anticipating the next word, which is why it was also hallucinating. If you asked it the statistics for the birth rate in Mozambique based on the government report from the year 2030, it would tell you the birth rate, even though the report doesn't exist. Because it would hallucinate on the basis of what it expected in the language. Now, that was very long ago. That was like 100 years ago in AI terms. We're not there anymore. We're now in a world where the artificial intelligence can learn the language. It can then reason about the language which it's learned. It can then write new language in addition to the old language. It's called machine learning. And it will do what we call double loop reasoning to look back through a critical lens at, is the language which I've written about the language which I analyzed correct, given the other language? So you have the capacity for triple blind review within the language model. Not only that, these AIs have now been built in such a way that they can do an activity, pause, reflect on the activity, and go again, and give themselves new instructions. What does that mean? It means that if you want to write a book about mathematics, you can tell the AI, if you use an agentic AI, I use a particular one, it's a Chinese one called Manus. You can tell the AI, I want to write a textbook about mathematics. I want you to find the curriculums for 10 top maths courses, and I want you to summarize their key insights and provide me with an outline. Then I want you to proceed to start writing the chapters. And then you can leave the AI. And what it will do is it will create a folder. Inside the folder, it will create root folders. It will go and find the information. It will put the information in the folders. It will then read its own documents to generate new documents, and it will keep repeating this agentic, agent-based process until it has written you a textbook. If you don't believe me, try it. It's quite mind-blowing. However, what these agentic AIs can also do is generate photos, videos, all kinds of other content, including facial recognition software, including IDs, including all the things that make payments. That agentic AI, if you asked it, will create for you the invoices for the fraudulent business which is about to be used to rob you from your real business. And so with this AI comes the risk of scalable impersonation through automated social engineering. This is an exciting new world. And how will we know the truth from the real from the unreal? I did a conference on the future of artificial intelligence. We were in London with a group of policymakers, and after really thinking hard for a week with experts about the problem, we came to the conclusion that the UN is going to need a charter for global digital rights, like a human rights charter. The world is going to need a global digital security council. And then the world will have to invest ultimately in a super mind form of artificial intelligence that monitors the use of digital and AI for the protection of humanity. The only way to police the AI will be to build an AI that polices the AI. It's coming. It's a difficult problem to solve. It's a problem that represents big risks to the payment system. And linked to those big risks is the issue of identity theft through what we see as deepfakes. There was an incident in Hong Kong where a trader received an instruction, a video instruction from his CFO to make a transfer of $25 million. And he did the transfer. It turned out the video was a fake. It was what we call a deep fake. They take a video of you singing jingle bells, and then they superimpose the face of a CFO onto you, all the facial movements, with all the nuances of how you move, and they're getting better and more believable. I get at least one request per week from an elderly family member saying, should I invest in this opportunity of Johan Rupert telling Malema to not invest in Elon Musk, the biggest load of. But they exist. You can go and look for them. And they look pretty real. And so the risk of that real-time impersonation, and then of course, as I was saying, what is the solution to that? At some level, we're going to see AI-driven real-time analytics replacing rules-based systems to detect anomalous behavior and block fraudulent transactions. Now, that's the solution, but in the solution, it contains its own risk. What happens when the AI, so you may not know this, in one of the big houses that have produced AI, they have had the challenge of having to switch off a number of versions of their artificial intelligence because they found it creating backdoors to switch itself back on once it's switched off. In addition to that, they had two artificial intelligences talking to each other. Now, when you have these artificial intelligence talking to each other, there was a point at which the AIs began to talk to each other in a new language because they found that the language they were using was too inefficient. It would be better for them to just talk to each other in a new language that they understand. The problem was that the humans didn't understand what that language meant. And so at that point, for safety reasons, they had to pull the plug. And so, these are the risks. These are the game changers. But what does it mean for the future of payments? As a futurist, it's a brave new world, but what I can see emerging is what I would call an aware financial system. What is an aware financial system? An aware financial system is one where I walk into a shopping mall, and the shopping mall knows that I've arrived. Not the people working in the shopping mall, the shopping mall. When I go into a store and I buy an item, my bank knows, of course, that I bought the item, but my insurance also knows that I bought the item. And I get a message, as is beginning to happen, from my insurer or my bank asking me if it's really me that has really bought the item so that they can add it to my insurance profile to protect me from the risks. And so we're starting to see a sort of a double loop communication of an aware financial system. Now, how do we govern that system? Because at some level that becomes ungovernable. It's too complex, it's too fast moving, it's too many moving parts, it's too difficult to get our heads around. Well, I think personally there are 5 key uncertainties that will determine which direction this goes. And it looks a little bit different if you're in China. China is already a surveillance state. It's got an incredible market, it's got an incredible economy, highly dynamic, lots of innovation taking place, but it sits within a framework of state control. That looks very different from the UAE, which has a similar sort of framework of state control, but has made an aggressive commitment to artificial intelligence, the digitization of the economy for innovation. Which means the UAE will take risks that are way beyond what China might think to do. And that's then again very different from what we're seeing in the UK or the broader Europe, where real concerns about privacy has sort of slowed down the innovation process. And so what do we see looking ahead? 5 key uncertainties. Number 1, the key uncertainty around governance and sovereignty. Do we see institutional intermediaries, banks, large institutions, the SARB, controlling the emergence of these technologies? Or do we see algorithmic, disrupted corporate architectures, business driving the agenda? Depending on which way it goes, or depending on the balance between those two, we will see a very different future. The second one, will we see monetary value forming uncertainties? Will we see the domination of tokenization, digital currencies, virtual money? Will my son, who's now 15, who bought V-Bucks when he was 7, will he come to me when he is 30 and say, Dad, I don't want to inherit your house and your farm and your bank account. I would love you to leave me Bitcoin. Who knows what future he will want, or my girls, where they will play. Or will we see states, governments, clamp down and insist that there has to be some kind of state-controlled fiat money that is the basis of exchange? Or will we see something in the middle, like a sovereign dollar-backed, rand-backed virtual currency where you can trade your Bitcoin, other coins, but you have to trade them via a sovereign currency? And these decisions will be made very quickly in the next 3 to 5 years of which direction we go. The third one is around trust, security, and resilience. I heard in the previous point someone says something about verification, super important. Will we continue to see a payments world with a human face, where human-to-human relationships matter? I get the phone call from the bank. Hi, is this Dr. Oosthuizen? Yes, it is. Hi, my name is Julia. Now, Julia, I'm very busy. But I have to now stop my biological bag of energy, which is my body, I have to slow it right down so that she can make sounds with her mouth over her phone so that I can hear them in a drum, very old-fashioned technology, so that two humans, through their nous, their, what the Germans call Fingerspitzengefühl, can understand, am I talking to the real person who says it's the real person, and how do I know? Well, I ask them then a bunch of questions about their technology. Is this your email address? Is this your cell phone? Do you own a cat called Julie? I mean, it's getting crazier and crazier. Will we continue to rely on human verification, or will we find some kind of technological verification? I was reminded of what was his name? Ronald Reagan, the president, saying to Mikhail Gorbachev, yes, we can trust each other in the Cold War. Trust, but verify. This is the future of payments. The fourth one, the uncertainty around infrastructure and interoperability. Who will build the infrastructure? How far will it go? And will they work together? So will we see the standardization of scalable infrastructure? Or are we going to see the network diversity of a world in chaos? And I've put an image there of rocks and rivers. A different set of scenarios we did around this in energy says that we're moving into a world of rocks, hard blocks, friction against each other. But at the same time, amidst those blocks, there are rivers, flexible, adjustable, emergent ways of collaborating. What kind of future will we have in terms of infrastructure, rocks or rivers? And then the last one here, what are the role players going to do in the ecosystem? Who will dominate? The banks, the platforms, or the fintechs? The banks, large, like the elephant, lots of institutional memory, move slowly, very powerful. The platforms, a bit like the lions. Who gets the lion's share? There's a handful of them that hunt, that compete quite aggressively. Or the wild dogs. They hunt as a pack. They're small, they're flexible, they can hide. And they intimidate the enemy by surrounding him. Who's going to win the battle? What role players will they be, and who will dominate? Now, which futures does this bring us to? From where I stand as a futurist, as an analyst, there are really two key uncertainties that will shape the future of payments. The first key uncertainty is trust and value. Will trust be based on ad hoc decentralized systems and value, or will it be formal and centralized, which is where we've come from with payments? And then there's another key uncertainty at the top, which is what will be the governance logic of the payment system of the future? Will it be small actors working together like an orchestra, or will it be large, big actors building out this payment infrastructure? And maybe it will be a combination of those. From where I sit, this leads us to three futures. The future which I think is the best one is the digital commons, which is a bit like the human rights world. We all have rights, and we all have a right to our rights. It's imperfect how we implement that, but we can all agree at some level that we share them. Similarly with payments, we all have a right to trade, to exchange value, to own value. But what is the means by which we exchange that? That's the digital commons, where we have that in common at a human level. There is the possibility of sovereign silos, where the world fractures more and more and more. And you see this in a very real time. So in the last month, Mr. Trump has put tariffs on India. Why has he put tariffs on India? Because India is buying oil from Russia in ruble instead of in dollar, and shouldn't be buying it in the first place, according to Mr. Trump. Now, in the process, what is he forcing India to do? He's forcing India to choose which side of the line are you on? China, Russia, Iran, or the US, Europe, Australia? Of course, India is part of a little group called the Quad, where the US, France, Australia, and India are friends in the Pacific. So the geopolitics influences the economic, which will influences the regulation and the infrastructure, which will determine whether we are in a sovereign silo. And then lastly, will we see something in between, which is sort of a chaotic disruption? Now, each of these scenarios has a unique attribute to it. The digital commons, I think, will be an AI-driven fraud detection environment, which is embedded in the rails rather than just in endpoints. And we'll make the slides available. I see a couple of people taking photos. I think the sovereign silo scenario is one in which regulatory divergence and geopolitical competition create a patchwork of sovereign silos. We're moving a little bit in that direction already. And then the third one, the chaotic disruption, lack of standards, leads to frequent systemic shocks. If you think the global financial crisis was tough, which came about because of a housing crisis, imagine the global financial crisis which will come about because of a digital economic bubble. It'll make the global recession look like a picnic. And so this is not a future to which we want to move. And so what are the implications as I come to a close? What are the implications? And how do we choose a pathway? Well, I think number one, the big question is going to be around who owns which aspect of this ecosystem. Does Google buy Vodafone to create an Africa interoperable payments world? Does Facebook buy Total and create a real-world energy communication network where he who owns the data or she who owns the data controls the consumer? Who owns which aspect becomes very important. Number two, who shapes the links in the ecosystem? Is it neutral third-party organizations like yourself, associations that create the standards, that build the bridges between the ecosystems? Or do we leave it over to the politicians, where egos and short-term political agendas use our payments world as a bargaining chip for power? And then three, who leads this process of creating this new system, and how do they lead it? Are they leading it, and they'll jump back quickly, are they leading it towards a digital commons? Are they leading it towards sovereign silos? Or are they leading it towards chaotic disruption? My final thought before I take some questions, what should we do? So you and I are small, we're a little actor in a big ecosystem. How do we get our heads around this? I think the answer is we need to be the plankton. What is the plankton? You see there a picture of the ocean and all these shiny little things that the moonlight refracts with, and the energy in their little bodies cause luminescence in the sea. It's called plankton. There are trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of them. We've never heard of them. No one ever taught me in biology, this is the plankton, but it's super important. What do? They are the basis of the marine food web. They produce a huge portion of the ocean's oxygen. How do they do that? They consume the carbon dioxide in the water and turn it into oxygen. At the same time, they provide food for the fishes, the larvae, the whales, and they are of such a scale in the ocean that they can influence the weather. But yet they're invisible, they're unspoken of. And I think the solution in this future is for individuals like yourselves who care about an integrated, interoperable, trustworthy system that serves humanity, is we need to find a way to be the plankton that operates throughout the system. Can Africa, South Africa, with its capabilities in banking, financial services, its innovation, can we find that role within the global system? Lots to think about. Thank you very much. I have a couple of minutes to respond to some questions, and I hope there's some good ones. Let's have a look. Someone says, while there's a global surge in innovation around the future of payments, digital wallets and real-time transfers and cross-border payments, over half the world's population remain unbanked and underbanked. How do we reconcile this disparity? What practical steps can be taken? Well, it reminds me of a conversation I had with a national bank in an East African country, where the conversation was, we have a population of 40 million people. We have a banking sector of 4 million clients. And the conversation the bank was having was, what can we do to solve this problem? And we came to the conclusion that there's not much the bank can do. It doesn't have the branches, it doesn't have the staff, it doesn't have the backbone. But there are other problems that the 40 million face, in fact 36 million. One of them is they also don't have ID cards. Very difficult to travel, to do business, to just get through life without a functional ID card. And so the scenario we came up with was, what if the bank partnered with the state and said to the government, and formed another partnership with someone like a Google or an Amazon, we will support you in getting a digital ID card to every citizen. On the digital ID card, we will put a smart chip with a basic utility bank account. Because what we would then be doing, instantly by giving the person a formal identification, we would also be giving them banking as a utility. The problem with the private bank is it's too greedy. But how do we control that customer? Well, if you are going to have a customer base, not of 4 million, but of 40 million, you may need to lose half. You may need to give up some of that pie in exchange for growing your customer base from 4 million to 40 million. And so there are solutions, but in the context of the Global South, we have to think outside of our narrow product or service to solve those solutions. What will define the winners of the next era of payment technologies? Trust, scale, customer experience? That's interesting. Igor Ansoff, the strategist, said, strategy is 3 things. Who is the customer? What is value to the customer? And how do I reach the customer? I think you can never get away from that. At some point, you have to understand how you add value to the customer, what that customer experience is going to be. But in the context of payments, where the payments need to be ubiquitous, interconnected, scalable, and universal across multiple platforms, I don't think the winner is going to be only the person who understands the customer. I think it's the person who understands the customer and understands the ecosystem and can anticipate where in the ecosystem do I need to position, what is the capability that I need to position with to maximize customer value on the one side and interoperability on the system on the other side. It'll probably, if I had to put my money on it, it'll probably be a kid from a township in Ethiopia who grew up in the granularity of that challenge, but on the crossroads of regional trade, who has the kind of mindset to solve that problem. Just dump them in a banking academy and teach them how to program. They'll come up with a solution on their own. How can business leverage embedded payments to create seamless experiences without losing the human or relational touch? That's interesting. Well, I think the answer lies somewhere going deeper into why is human touch so important? And there are a number of things. One of them is physiology. So when I meet you and you're a nice person and you smile because you know me and my face is familiar, what is happening at the physiological level is your nervous system is releasing dopamine and serotonin because you are seeing something that is familiar, which you've seen before, and you're happy to experience that again. It's that familiarity. Now, if I see you and I like you and I remember you, but then I remember that you owe me money, then maybe my system starts producing cortisol, which means that I'm glad to see you, but not for the reasons you think. And so there's no way of getting around that unless you do what the social media platforms are doing, where they manipulate the customer by dumping dopamine addiction on them. So I'll show you something I'll show you a picture, I'll remind you of your grandchild before I try and sell you something. It's highly manipulative. They're actually drugging you to buy. And they know this, and there's been studies that talk about it. My recommendation is that that's not the route. Why? Because the younger generation have figured that out. And they're starting to experience social media at some level as toxic. In fact, they're leaving certain platforms because they know that that's a toxic relationship. It's inherently an extractive relationship. I think there's a better way, which I think is that once you understand the customer, there's a connection at the level of narrative and service. Who are you? What are you trying to do in the world? What matters to you? And how can I help you do that? I think if we create the narrative where we connect with that person's identity and purpose, that can be done through technology, and that will, to some extent, mimic the human interface. I have my suspicions about whether we could ever do that fully with technology without some human behind the scenes providing the meaning and the values and the storyline. And that's coming from someone who uses technology all the time, AI and the rest of it. What's your take on how quantum computing can help to drive innovation and efficiency in global payments? That's a super interesting one. Who asked that question? I need to buy them a beer at some point. So quantum, because that's a cool question. So there's these two very exciting developments in the computing world. The one is quantum computing, where we're saying instead of sending ones and zeros through an electric cable, or a fiber optic cable in the form of light, what if we used the subatomic character of the fabric of science, the fabric of reality, the complexity of those, the array of stages and states in which the subatomic particle can be to do computing? And humanity has now invented ways of doing that. The first time I came across that 15 years ago was in a conference where someone spoke about the first attempt at quantum computing, where they were taking a liquid state matter and they were cooling it to something like minus 100 degrees to slow down the behavior of the subatomic particles enough to then input data to see what comes out the other end. Because basically what comes out the other end is the quantum mechanics of the subatomic particles. They move in a pattern, and depending on what's in the data, they will produce a pattern on the outside which tells you about what's going on in the data. So what's the practical use of that? You take all the cell phone recordings of the entire east coast of the US, of people talking, and you digitize it, and you use the CIA's quantum computer to put it in there with 3 or 4 keywords. Terrorist, plane, building, something else. And it will tell you where in the billions of terabytes of data the pattern is emerging. So that exists, and it's being created. It's not sci-fi, it's reality. So how do we use that in the payments world? I suspect that as digital payments expands, there will be a point at which the sheer size of the payments data will be of a scale that it cannot be managed by conventional computing, and it will have to be managed and processed and interpreted using something like quantum computing. Now, do we have the programming and the other expertise yet to do that? Probably not, but that's an exciting new space into which we might want to move. And then the last question here, how close are we to truly borderless payments, and what barriers stand in the way? So obviously, we come from a world where humans had an identity based in geography. So I am a Zulu from KwaZulu. What is KwaZulu? It's a place. You go there. It's a thing. Or I am a Xhosa or I am a Omani from Oman. We come from there as human beings, where our identity is place. If you track that back before nation states, before national banking systems, that's how we understood ourselves. Because my tribe was across the river from your tribe, and the river was the line. It's a bit like Zim in South Africa and Limpopo. Not much has changed. But what has changed is humanity has been gathering itself into larger and larger and larger groups of people. We call that urbanization, but we also call it agglomeration. And as we agglomerate, we start to relate across those boundaries. So you are from Limpopo, but you're my wife. So when I go home, I must pay Labola, but when we come to the city, then you carry the credit card. It's complex. The same thing is going to happen and is happening with the payments world. The current payments world is built on the paradigm of place-based identity and agglomeration. Communities, societies, countries, states. The payment system of the future doesn't have identity politics problems. it moves interoperably across borders. The barrier to that largely is humans and the mindset we have. Because what happens is our mindset produces the institutions, and the institutions we have produce the systems, and the systems we have then lock in some power relationships between do you use the dollar or the this or the that, and those things are difficult to change. And so why am I describing all of that history and background? Because the question was, how far are we from a truly transferable? On the one hand, we're very far from it because people still have hang-ups and governments still have control. But on the other hand, the horse is bolted. If I wanted to take 10 Rand and send it right now anywhere in the world, the only thing I need is an internet connection. And if I connect to one of Elon Musk's low-orbit satellites while I'm in Ghana, I can download that, whether it's Ghana or Togo or Japan. It doesn't matter. As long as I have a mobile device and a low-orbit satellite connection, the money can move. The technology is already there to do it. And so we have a catch-up game to play. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Enjoy the rest of your conference, and good luck.
Please don't run away, because as you were talking, there were two more that kind of snuck in there, but the one which I thought was interesting, and maybe we can deal with that before we wrap up. Someone was saying here that the game that you were talking about is Fortnite, and they were wondering if you did end up allowing the V-Bucks to be purchased from your credit card.
I did allow him to do it, and it was Fortnite, but Fortnite is no longer cool. But yes, in the interest of his education and my own, I then allowed him to buy a new skin using V-Bucks.
And just borrowing an extra minute, someone says here, what is then the balance between traditional, digital, and alternative payment methods, taking into account all the methods tie into existing customer types?
Is the question, what is the difference between them?
What is the balance?
What is the balance? So we have to be, with these things, we do have to at some level be practical. All the work we do depends at some level on a business model somewhere. And in that business model, there are two waves, like the waves of a sea. The first wave is the business of today, how we get paid, who our customers are and how we get paid. And the second wave is the business of tomorrow. Now, where is the balance? The balance for each business, each organization, is in the intersection between the business of today, how we get paid right now, and the business of tomorrow, how we get paid in the future, and at what rate, I call it the delta. At what rate of transformation can we shift our business model from the business of today to the business of tomorrow? Some businesses will do it quickly and overnight. Other businesses will take long to do it because of internal constraints. At the end of the day, it depends on the customer. If your customer is shifting into that new reality and you're not, they won't be your customer for very long. If your customer is shifting into that new reality and you can catch up to them and keep pace with them, they'll stay your customer, they'll be loyal. There's a third possibility where you move into that new reality ahead of your customer, and then you lose them for different reasons. You're distracted, you're building value that they don't understand. And so it's a delicate balance between business model, timing investment, understanding the customer. And again, good luck. Thank you.
Let's give him a round of applause. What a fantastic speaker. Thank you so much.